from Lime Design, and today for my Doodling with Debbie feature for Sam Says Stamp, I'm embossing a background using the Marilyn Stencil and then highlighting the embossed design with Nouveau Embellishment mousse from Tonic Studios. I don't know about you, but my thoughts have already turned to the changing season. Perhaps it's the really wet summer we've had here in the UK, which is making it feel like autumn already. Whatever the weather, it's always good to be working ahead though, and so I chose a soft autumn palette of pinks, peaches and burgundy with copper to tone. I'm starting out with a piece of Archer's cold press watercolour card and blending a gradient of colour from the lightest Rosy Cheeks ink through Melon ink and finally to Merlot ink. The advantage of using a watercolour card is it takes the ink blending really well and it's easy to get a smooth transition. Also being so thick, the watercolour card will handle the treatment I'm going to give it, and the thickness of the card is a benefit to get a nice clear impression when embossing with the stencil. Having worked my way from the lightest ink to the darkest, I'm now going back down the gradient to make sure all the transitions are nicely blended. I'm then taking the ink blended panel and a tan embossing mat, and I've laid the Marilyn stencil over the top and kept the sandwich in place with washi tape. I'm using the Big Shot machine and I have the number 1 tab open for the embossing. I'm never quite sure on the correct embossing technique. I often find that when I follow the instructions I don't get a deep enough impression, so with the sandwich held in place with washi tape I can play around with the thickness of the sandwich until I get a nice clear impression of the stencil on the card. I found that when running the sandwich through with just one cutting mat I could barely see the embossing, so I ran it through again with 2 cutting mats, and I suggest you do the same with your machine, as all machines are different. I find that even those from the same company can be different. So start with a thin sandwich and work thicker until you get the embossing you are happy with. And here you can see how the pressure of running the stencil through the die cutting machine with the tan embossing mat has embossed the beautiful design into the ink blended watercolour card. Beautiful as the embossed panel is, I wanted to highlight the design further by rubbing Nouveau Embellishment mousse over the raised areas of the design. I've picked up a few colours which tone with the ink blended gradient: Mother of Pearl, Coral Calypso and Fresh Copper. I want to add the mousses just to the raised areas of the embossing, so I'm using my finger at a shallow angle so that I can rub the mousse only over the raised areas of the design. I'm using a light application of the mousse as I don't want any blobs of mousse to find their way into the valleys of the embossing. Having applied a layer of fresh copper over the darker end of the ink blended panel, I'm now moving on to the lovely Coral Calypso and blending that over the middle third of the panel in line with the area I had blended with the melon ink. Finally, I'm moving on to the Mother of Pearl mousse, and I think this one of the 3 really brings the panel to life by bringing in some lovely light shimmery highlights. And now if I bring this close to the camera, you can see how the embellishment mousse sits on the raised areas of the design and gives a lovely shimmer and emphasises the embossing. I'm not quite finished with this panel yet though, as for those of you that have seen my cards before, you won't be surprised that I wanted to add a bit more sparkle to this background by splattering a solution of perfect pearls over the top. I used a scoop of perfect pearls in a range mini mister, give it a good shake, and then use the tube from inside to splatter sparkly droplets over the panel. I then dried this with a heat tool, and you can see here the extra sparkle that the perfect pearls gives to the background. Where possible, I like to cut a background panel with a die to ensure nice clean edges that are perfectly cut to size. My current favourite are the wonky rectangle dies from Sam Says Stamp, and I'm using the largest of those to die cut the embossed panel. While I'm die cutting, I'm also going to cut the clustered leaves die through twice with Sam Says Stamp vellum. This die is one of my all-time favourites as I love the gently arching spray of die cut leaves. For the sentiment for this card, I'm going to use a combination of stamps and dies. The die I've chosen is the Script Thanks from Sam Says Stamp, and I'm going to continue the copper theme by cutting it from card covered in sun-kissed copper gilding flakes from Tonic Studios. I've cut a piece of Be Creative tape sheet to size and adhered it to a scrap of ivory card. I can then peel off the adhesive backing and gently add gilding flakes to the sticky surface. You don't need to worry about whether there are extra bits of gilding flakes overlaying one another. At this point you just want to concentrate on getting every bit of adhesive covered in copper. Then you can rub your finger over the top and any extra pieces come away. Equally you can use a brush such as this Range of Perfect Pearls brush to work away any excess and brush them to one side. There is no waste with this technique as any extra pieces of gilding flakes can be funnelled back into the pot to use another time. The result is a piece of card with a lovely textured copper finish from which to die cut the Script Thanks die. I made sure to add an extra shim in my die cutting sandwich to get a nice clean cut through the gilding, adhesive tape and card. To complete the sentiment, I'm using the Thoughtful Messages set. I've mounted one of the complimentary sentiments on the drawer of the Mini Misty and then treated a piece of slate card with a powder tool. I'm going to heat emboss the sentiment, and the powder tool will help prevent any embossing powder sticking where I don't want it to. I've stamped the sentiment in clear embossing ink and then sprinkled with white embossing powder before melting the powder with a heat tool. I've then trimmed the card to a skinny strip, and now I'm ready to start putting the pieces together. I've cut, scored and folded an ivory card base and then added foam adhesive to the back of the embossed panel and added it to the card base. I love vellum, but it can be tricky to adhere without the glue being visible, so my usual method of securing it in place is to hide adhesive behind elements on the card. I've arranged the vellum leaves and copper thanks where I plan to have them, and then added foam adhesive to the back of the sentiment strip. When laying this in place over the vellum leaves, the sentiment strip sticks to the vellum and keeps the leaves arrangement in place. I then flipped the leaves over and added another strip of foam tape behind the sentiment strip, and used this to adhere the leaves to the embossed panel. I then added Ranger Multimedia Matte to the back of the thanks die cut and adhered that above the sentiment strip. To accent the card and really pull out the colours I've used, I've got some Nouveau Crystal drops from Tonic Studios. These will not only accent the card, but also provide another place for me to add adhesive to the vellum. At the moment, the vellum leaves are only attached at their base by the sentiment strip, and if I were to stand the card upright, the leaves would flop forward. However, once I've added the crystal drops and allowed them to dry, I can then go back in afterwards and put dots of Ranger Multimedia Matte on the vellum behind the crystal drops on the leaves. The colours of crystal drops I used were Copper Penny, Bubblegum Blush and Ivory Seashell. I recommend getting the drops liquid to the tip of the bottle by practising on a scrap piece of card first. This means that you don't get any air bubbles in the droplets as you first start squeezing the bottle. And that completes my card using the Marilyn Stencil to emboss an ink-blended panel and then using Nouveau Embellishment mousse to emphasise the embossing. The copper tones are continued in the die-cut sentiment and in the crystal drops accenting the vellum leaves. On the Simon Says Stamp blog you'll find a coordinating blog post as well as details of the supplies I've used today. If you want to find me, I blog over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.